has strict piracy rules. Anyway, this is a picture from a book, but this is an extremely historic picture. And again, maybe Herman will point out, but what you'll see here is you'll see a tall gentleman in the middle of the picture, and I believe that is Fred Ross. And then to the right on the picture is Herman Gallegos. And then next to him, that tall guy right there, that's John Marcoida, who we're hoping that gets here pretty soon. And then moving over, you see the little guy in the suit with a nice tie. That's Cesar Chavez. Moving back to the middle, the tall guy, Fred Ross, to his left is Sololinsky. And so again, we've heard all these stories, how all these people came to this town and found these little humble people and started everything, but I don't think that's what happened. Dr. Herman Gallegos.
Thank you, Ramon, and thank you all very much for coming. You honor me by your presence. I've had a long-standing relationship with NHU, and it really warms my heart to be here when I recall that Bob Cruz's vision for NHU was just but a distant memory and became fact. And I'll always remember the meetings with the students when Bob used to say, "You will succeed. You will succeed. You will succeed." And he would say that over and over again, but would back that up with a solid support system, which he felt strongly about. And reminds me very much of a talk that the late Samuel Gompers made in the early 1900s. Samuel Gompers, in his time, was the head of the AFL, and he was a very famous labor leader. And Mr. Gompers made a speech where he dedicated a school. And at the school, he said, if all the money went into the building of the school, that the money would be well spent, if it only helped just one youngster. And afterward, someone went up to him and said, well, Mr. Gompers, did we hear you right that the money, $1 million, went to help just one youngster, that it would be well spent? He said, yes, especially for my son or your son or someone else's son or daughter. And I think that's what Bob felt, that every individual was important. The numbers game is sometimes something that people get evaluated on, but Bob felt that each person, each individual had merit and worth. So I hope that the vision of Bob Cruz will be kept alive, even though there may be a change of ownership. And I proposed earlier to someone that perhaps instead of calling this a distinguished series lecture, that this should be called the Bob Cruz, Dr. Bob Cruz Memorial Lecture, and that every year. Now, I might introduce my wife who's here with me, Maricela Monterrubio Gallegos. Maricela is herself an activist. She's on three boards, including the National Council of La Raza. Now, another reason why I'm very happy to be here is because this is the place where I began my activism and my career. And this is where the community service organization, the CSO, helped launch an empowerment of people that really fed to the future development of this community, so that a lot of the progress that we see today had its roots here in Salsipuedes, and it had effects in improving the social, economic, and political opportunities for people of the area. Now, there are three versions of how Salsipuedes got its name. One was the economic problems. People had to struggle to get out because there was high unemployment, and there were all kinds of problems economically and moving out. People could be culturally rich but economically poor. So they said this was Salsipuedes. Another version is that when it rained, you had to get up in the middle of the night, move your damn car, otherwise you'd get stuck because there was no paved streets. That's how they called it Salsipuedes. Another version, the one I like, is there were two Baco Locos that were robbing the grocery store on Summer and Tremont, and it happened they did that just when the deputy sheriff was coming on the scene, and they were running like heck to run away. One was ahead of the other one got stuck in the mud. He said, "Jorge, ayúdame, help me." And the guy in front turned around and said, "Sal si puedes." So, there are winners and losers in a lot of situations. Now, of course, there were many, many persons responsible for the success of the CSOs, not just one person, but certainly Cesar's name crops up, and we highlight the passing of his death today. Now, when I became active, I was elected the first president of the CSO chapter, and Cesar, first vice president. We were in our early 20s. We were very green. We had no experience, but we were nominated to run for office. So the night before, we went to my house, and we stayed up till late at night practicing. We were nervous, and oh my God, and we just couldn't know what to do. So finally, around 3 o'clock, I said to Cesar, I said, let's just tomorrow say what we feel, not worry about it. So anyway, what happened is that the next night, we gave our speeches, the elections were held, and we won. So we went up to Fred Ross and said, "Fred, we can't believe it, we won. We didn't think our speeches were that great." And Fred said, "It wasn't." "Oh?" I said, "Well, then how come we won?" He said, "Well, who was out there week after week, night after night, going door to door, knocking on doors, registering voters, talking to the people about the issues? Do you think the people who came and gave speeches were out there? No, they never were there. They just showed up tonight just to give the speeches." So at that moment, Cesar and I learned a valuable lesson. That action was the most important thing. And it didn't make any difference who got the credit. That in the long run, the people really know how to select their leaders. Now, later, I went on when CSO became a national organization to become the first vice president, and then Cesar later became national executive director, and I became national president. It's interesting that the national CSO elected 3 national presidents from folks who had been former chapter presidents from San Jose. One was Estimado Luis Zárate over there, and Al Piñon, and myself. So that San Jose did produce its share of leadership, I'm proud to say. Now, Cesar went on, of course, to do great things, which reminds me of my favorite Cesar Chavez story. Some years ago, my granddaughter came up to me and asked me, "Grandpa, is it true that you worked alongside with Cesar for many years?" "Yeah, and you did this and you did that." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Oh my God," she was so beside herself. Gee whiz, she couldn't believe it. And she looked at me with a kind of a puzzled face and said, "Grandpa, I have a question." I said, "Yeah, what is it, Natalie?" She says, "How come he's famous and you're not?" I said, "Mija," I said, "the Lord works in mysterious ways." Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we changed this feeling of sal si puedes, get out if you can. Because it was both a psychological and it was also an issue related to economics, to politics, and to physical area. So how did we move from this thinking from sal si puedes to si se puede? And I think it might be appropriate for me to share a little bit about my personal life, because a lot of people really don't know a lot about me. I mean, you work with people, but you don't know a lot about what happened. And I think that there may be some lessons in this, because they see me with a tie, and someone said, "Geez, you look more like a Republican every day." And I say, "I assure you I'm not." And sometimes it's really a uniform if you're on a board of directors of AT&T or a bank, or you're on a delegate to the United Nations, or on the board of a major foundation. So it's a uniform. But although we left the barrio physically, we never left it in terms of our commitment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I was born in a little mining town of Aguilar, Colorado. My father had gone into the mines when he was around 15, and he struggled mightily to make a living. But the significant thing about it is that Aguilar is about 5 miles from Ludlow, Colorado. In 1914, there was a strike by the miners against the Colorado Fuel and Iron, and the state militia had been called out to break the strike. Now the miners had set up a tent colony in Ludlow, and a lot of the families had dug holes into the ground to keep warm and store food. And on one Sunday afternoon, violence broke out, and the militia shot and killed people. And so the tents caught on fire, and a lot of the children suffocated below the ground. It was terrible. And my parents never forgot that, and we never forgot it, because my father would always remind us of the struggle that working people have to acquire justice. When my father was in danger of acquiring black lung disease, we moved to California, to San Francisco, in the middle of the Depression. And my father had to find work. He went on WPA, thank God. To make things worse, at age 9, I lost a leg, and that didn't help. And my poor family just didn't know what to do. A leg, we didn't even know that there was such a thing as a leg. But fortunately, the principal of the grammar school referred me to a charitable organization called Crippled Children's Society. And I remember one day, 2 ladies with long fur coats and well-coiffured hair came by to talk to my mother to see, I guess, if we were part of the worthy poor or whatever. But they put up the money, and I was around and walking and playing like any other kid. Today, a leg like that will cost $25,000, $40,000. But the other problem was not physical. It was overcoming some of the dilemmas that we faced. There were no bilingual teachers. There were no Hispanic teachers or role models. When I was in high school, my counselor advised me not to think about college because my family couldn't afford it, but I went anyway. But it was also during my teenage years that I learned about the power of nonviolent boycott and standing up for your rights. One day my brother came home crying from the corner grocery store where he'd been insulted by one of the clerks, and my mother was upset, said, well, we'll show them. So she said, what I want you to do is whenever you go to the grocery store, a block from the one down from the corner, on the way back, carry the groceries, walk by their store, don't say a word, just go straight home. So for a year we did that, down the hill, back up the hill, carrying our groceries past the other store. At the end of the year, the wife of one of the owners came to my mother. She was crying and pleaded, please come back. You know, they had fired the clerk, and they ended up giving my brother a part-time job. So it was at that moment I really learned the power of change, thanks to my mother. Now, I moved to San Jose, and I started working in Salsacuelas, in the Star and Bar station here on Alamac Avenue. And I remember meeting Ramon Martinez and so many folks from the barrio, and later moved here to the east side, and so became aware of what happened. I graduated on Friday and started work organizing on a Monday, but I had never really told people about the fact that I had a college education, because most people with a college education were looked upon as vendidos, as sellouts, or you were trying to brag and trying to flout your education. So I never talked about it, and I never pretended that I was better educated than anybody else. I just tried to fit in. So thanks to Saul Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation and the work he did in Chicago in the back of the Arts Council, he brought in Fred Ross. Remember when he spoke at the sociology class with Claude Settles and was talking about the terrific work that had gone in Los Angeles, where they fought police brutality. They resulted in the jailing of the police officers because they beat up these Mexican kids, the bloody Christmas incident, how they had registered voters that resulted in the election of Edward Roybal to the Los Angeles City Council. He became the first councilman in that city council in 80 years. And he talked about all the things that the CSO was doing. So I asked him, why don't you come out here to the east side, to Salsacuelas? So he looked around, and Alinsky wanted him to go to St. Louis to organize, but he said, no, I want to try So that's how we got started. And then he met Father Don McDonnell from Our Lady of Guadalupe, a brilliant priest who was very helpful in mentoring and helping us along the way, but he was also very helpful to us in another way. When we started to have our community meetings, we asked him to show up with his Roman collar, because at that time there was a lot of fears about communism. So he would show up with the Roman collar and everybody was assured that we were not a communist organization. And that was very important. And Fred Ross taught us these organizing skills, and we began to hold one-on-ones where we would meet with the person and introduce ourselves and just talk about ourselves and find out about them. We didn't pick their brains and what problems do you think we need to solve and how should we do it. We said, do you have a family? Where do you live? Where do you work? This is what I do. We build trust. Because you learn in this business that without trust you can't do anything. So we did one-on-ones, and then from there we developed house meetings, 5, 10 people at a time. And Fred would come in and he'd talk about organizing the way it was done in Los Angeles. So we had our first organizing meetings after we had done voter registration for weeks, and we had our elections. And then we began to take on issues. One of the first was take on John Tustin, the registrar of voters, because he refused to give us deputy registrars. So we challenged him on it. He said, well, the problem is if I give you, the Mexicans, deputies, I'm going to have to do that for Negroes and for Chinese and Asians. We said, what's wrong with that? You know, so we got our deputy registrars. I remember Cesar and I going to meet with Joseph Ritter, who was then the publisher of the San Jose Mercury News, and we challenging him because they were writing headlines, Mexican rat packs run wild in the East Side. And they weren't subtle about it, so we said, you know, you don't identify people because they're Greek or Irish or German when they're accused of something. Why do you keep identifying Mexicans? And he said, you know, you're right. So they stopped it. They stopped it then. I don't know if they've ever changed. But we also fought the Republicans because they were challenging our people at the polls. They would say, read 100 words from the Constitution. Well, they weren't asking Anglos to do that. They were only singling out Hispanics to do that. We had classes in basic English and citizenship at the Mayfair School and elsewhere, all volunteers. We had terrific volunteers like Johnny Torres, who was a barber and a chapter president. You couldn't go to Johnny's barbershop and sit down and not get off that chair unless you promised to register or go to classes or learn English. He was a heck of a registrar. And so we had people like Sofia Bojorquez, who was very involved in her church, who was used to going door to door. And even though she had a bad hip, man, she was our best door-to-door bird dog and getting people to register. And so they were wonderful volunteers. We had a terrific community education outreach program in the form of CSO Informe, a radio program we had for many, many years. And it was Juan Marcoida who did that week after week. And they'd get information about cancer education, about employment opportunities. And it was thanks to Los Hermanos Puentes, the grocery store chain that used to be there, that sponsored the program for years. And it was Julio Puentes' father who'd come into our meeting with a big Texas hat and a Pancho Villa mustache, this very tall, elegant gentleman who would sit there and nod and support us in his quiet way. And when we needed help, he talked to his sons, and his son said, yes, we will help you. And that's the way the organization was built. We challenged the Board of Education, we challenged the County Welfare Department, we challenged the health departments, we formed alliances with statewide civil rights organizations like the NAACP, the Jewish Labor Committee, the American Friends Service Committee, labor organizations, and we helped to pass fair practices and fair employment practices and fair housing legislation. So a lot of people talk about the civil rights movement beginning in 1968. You know, they don't know that we were involved in the 50s and the early 60s, involved in civil rights. I remember when Val Garcia, a World War II veteran, was trying to buy a house here on the East Side, they wouldn't let him. And Cesar and I went to see the real estate agent. He said, well, if he goes door to door and asks people's permission if a Mexican can buy here, I'll sell it to him. He said, no, you don't require anybody else to do that. You know, why should we require anybody else? So he got the house, but we didn't have fair housing legislation. So we fought for that. CSO was also involved in helping to begin a network of some 40 different barrio organizations throughout the state. Fresno, Dakota, Oakland, you name it, we were there. In 1960, we launched one of the first massive voter registration get out campaigns for Latinos in the state. And unfortunately, in September of 1960, a couple months before the election, Time magazine ran a big spread with pictures giving all the credit to the Viva Kennedy movement, which was a paper organization that was involved in supporting the candidacy of John Kennedy. Well, we were furious. So I wrote a letter to Time magazine and said, look, we're neither a Viva Nixon nor a Viva Kennedy organization. We save our Vivas for the poor and for the oppressed. Well, my phone started ringing. It was Bob Kennedy, it was Ted Kennedy. And the campaign people apologized and said, look, we goofed on this, it shouldn't have happened. So they lined up a meeting with Senator Kennedy at the Fairmont Hotel, and Ralph Vega, who was my first vice president, and I went to meet the senator. He was walking around in his white boxer shorts, and he apologized for what happened and said that, he said, you guys did a hell of a job, and when I get to the White House, I'll be more than pleased to have you go there to talk about your issues. We said, Senator, it's not that we're against you, it's just that whether you win or lose, we have to continue our legislative work in Sacramento and in Congress. And if somebody feels that somebody else did that registration work and take away the credit for the work we did, that it's going to hurt us. He said, no, I understand perfectly. We apologize. Now, as you revisit the East Side, now called the Mayfair District, even the name has been upgraded, you see a lot of wonderful improvements. There were no parks, there were no soccer fields, there were no paved streets, no sidewalks, no street lights. Silver Creek used to run over. Vector control had a real problem. Schools had a problem with getting parent participation. But yet, through all of what I call these small but important local issues, we began to build community. And by doing, we learned the process of organizing. Not by talking, but by doing. And we learned from each other. For example, we were involved in the passage of old age security to non-citizens, Pensiones Bill. And we worked for years to get that passed. We finally succeeded. But you know what? Even though the people benefit from it, what really happened is that we learned how Sacramento works, how to lobby, how to get people out to Sacramento, how to demonstrate how to write letters. So we learned the democratic process. We learned how to deal with the system in a nonviolent way. So we were very pleased. But as you visit Maravilla or Boyle Heights or Casa Blanca or whatever the barrio is that we worked in, you'll see improvements. Not complete change, but major changes. And I've certainly seen my share of them here. But the most important thing that came out of the CSO was the development and training of people. People who became empowered, not because somebody said, I'm going to designate you as a leader, but because we had a following and a membership of people who worked with us every step of the way. And out of this came persons like Cruz Reynoso, who was then, in the beginning, a small, a new lawyer working out of a small law firm in Calexico, who went on to become our first Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. A wonderful, wonderful human being who this day continues to be very active in the field of civil rights. There's a new film out, by the way, that just came out on Cruz. There's a DVD on Cruz. It's wonderful, and you should see it. We, of course, have persons that are known like Cesar and Dolores Huerta. We have people like Luis Zarate and El Piñon. We had Juan Puede, we had Rita Medina. Statewide basis, we had people like A.P. Tony Rios, J.J. Rodriguez, who was with the Butchers Union, went on to become the head of the Labor Federation in Alameda County. And Dolores, we had Gil Padilla, who was also one of the co-founders of the farm workers movement. People you don't hear about today, but who should be remembered. Abelicio Chavez, Alex Ormeño, Jimmy Delgadillo, Juan Boella, Henry Martinez, Antonio Bono. I can go down and on and on. I've met today people I haven't seen, and those that remember me about Joe Vasquez and others that were very much a part of our community. And so what we found is that in organization, people learn skills which are transferable. It's like a doctor. Doctor can graduate from university and then to a hospital, do the residency and practice in a clinic or whatever. But if they move from there to another state, they're still doctors and they use that skill. And that's the way with organizer skills. You learn how to use those wherever you go. So it was not a surprise that many of us who left CSO for various reasons went on to do other things, and I'll talk about that. But one of the things that we remember, because we were a democratically run organization with chapters that elected their officers, who then in turn elected our national officers, we paid dues. It was an independent organization. Unfortunately, there was no foundation money, but maybe it was just as well because we remained independent. And it was community controlled. But unfortunately, our history, I'm talking about Chicano Latino history, has now accumulated enough history to be able to know and look back on what has happened in recent years. See, I think a group that is willing to look at its history, look at its past, will be better understand the present and maybe affect the future. And so we have had a number of movements among our own people in California and the Southwest that started out with a boom, and now, some years later, there's no organization. It's dead. And you have to ask yourself why. And one of the reasons is the reason that Galarza used to warn us against. He said, look, he said, be very careful that you don't fall in the trap of depending on one or two so-called charismatic leaders. Because if they leave, for whatever reason, if they've not developed succession planning, if they've not developed a strong membership base, where the membership makes its own decisions, instead of being told what to do from the top down, the organization is not going to be surviving. So I think these are teaching moments for us, and I would hope that our studies programs would begin to look at this and remember that there are some lessons now that we can learn from in our own history. Now, I think that just a few items about what I think organizing teaches you and helps you. First of all, it builds people's capacity to participate effectively or more effectively. But you do this because you are learning through broad-based independent organizations, where you learn by your mistakes and by your experience. But I think the most important and exciting thing is what happens to us as individuals. The exciting thing that I had no clue, and I had no anticipation that 20, 30 years from now I would be working, doing certain things, or ended up doing the things I'm doing. I mean, I wasn't doing these things that I was starting to do because I felt I was going to end up getting a good job. In fact, my dad used to warn me, geez, aren't you afraid you're going to lose your job? You're out there picketing and you're out doing this. Aren't you afraid you're going to lose your job? I said, no, I hadn't thought about it, but the skills you learn enable you to pass on and transfer those skills elsewhere. But again, part of that is because we were under the mentoring and tutelage of Fred Ross, Soloninsky. And we learned that even though we talk about lifting ourselves up by our own bootstraps, we benefited because there were people like an Olinsky and a Fred Ross willing to help us from the outside. We didn't do it all by ourselves. We did it because many folks stood up and helped us here in Santa Clara County from various communities. So we're grateful for that. And we should always remember that in building alliances and cooperation, that we will advance much quicker. I think for me, we learned that freedom, that true freedom, is a constant struggle. That power is not given, but it's generated by people who share a common vision and who are willing to build an organization to gain respectful power relationships in their local community. So freedom is there for us, but we lose it because we don't participate. And those of us who participate must be mindful that we have to be active in keeping democracy going. Organizing is sometimes about confronting power, holding power accountable. And it's not just winning on an issue, but it's monitoring, evaluating, being there to hold those issues accountable. Not just win and then go, but hold accountable. And at times it may be controversial. I can't tell you how many times we were criticized because we decided to take an action. But we were committed to nonviolent action, so we were never afraid of what we were doing. There are other folks who believe the way to do it is cooperation, collaboration, consensus building. But there are times when we felt, no, we had to take direct action. So we were never afraid of action. Yes, a lot has happened since I began some 58 years ago. The Hispanic community has worked very hard to call attention to our needs throughout the country and to the condition of Hispanics nationally. But it wasn't just organization, it was our numbers. Our numbers are so overwhelmingly large. And in fact, we knew that our population was doubling every 10 years. And we were concerned because it was moving faster than the ability or the willingness of institutions to deal with this vast population group. So the schools ended up, without figuring out how to deal with keeping students in school, we still have a high dropout rate. I don't think we solved that problem yet. We didn't deal with the changing demographics in ways that would help keep people employed. And we have, Sal just shared with you a report about the horrendous overrepresentation of Latinos in the criminal justice system here in Santa Clara County. It was bad for us when Louis and I were there, and it seems to be worse now. But it's a problem all over the state and all over the country. We are overrepresented on death row and in state prisons and institutions and juvenile halls. You know, it's a terrible situation. Let me just say that what we really understood is that we understood the inherent idea that people are not the problem, but we are the resource for bringing about change. Now, before he ran for president, Barack Obama said this about community organizing that's worth remembering. As you can see, I'm really high on organizing. This is what he said. Organizing begins with the premise that, number one, problems facing inner city communities do not result from a lack of effective solutions, but from a lack of power to implement those solutions. Number two, that the only way for communities to build ongoing long-term power is by organizing people and money around a common vision. And three, that leadership, and not one or two charismatic leaders, can knit together the diverse interests of our community. Obama went on to say that once such a vehicle is formed, it holds the power to make politicians, agencies, and corporations more responsive to community needs. Equally important, it enables people to break their crippling isolation from each other, to reshape their mutual values and expectations, and rediscover the possibilities of acting collaboratively, the prerequisites of any self-help initiatives. Now today, all over the country, you see hundreds of groups committed to organizing, and especially organizing espoused like Saul Alinsky and Industrial Areas Foundation. In 1967, I had the privilege, along with Dr. Ernesto Galarza and Dr. Riyad Zamora, to co-found what is today the National Council of La Raza, which is the largest constituency-based organization in the country with about 300 affiliates throughout the country. This was a significant achievement for two reasons. First, this was the first time that a national foundation, the Ford Foundation, committed to making adequate levels of long-term support to help the Hispanic community. And number two, we succeeded in organizing first throughout the Southwest, and then later at the state and national level into a council that brought together Latino groups from throughout the country. So my challenge to you is that in order to ensure a better future for our community, we should continue to seek and support opportunities for developing and empowering our communities by generating new indigenous community-based leadership from the bottom. Now in the next half of my presentation, I'm going to present you with another challenge. And that challenge is for you to consider something I've had a hand in pioneering for some time, an area that a lot of people really haven't given a lot of thought to. That is that we need to do more about opening the doors to organized philanthropy. We need to do more about making foundations and corporations more responsive to the needs of Hispanic causes. Now, why is this challenge so important? Why is incorporating diverse points of view that would include Latinos and other minorities into those boards' governing structures? First, let's look at the stakes. According to the New York Times, philanthropic contributions in the United States total $300 billion in 2006. According to the Council of Foundations information, there are about 69,000 private independent foundations, about 2,600 corporate foundations, 707 community foundations, 4,700 operating foundations, that is, those that administer service and run their own programs. In 1975, I did a study that showed that at that time, even though we were 5% of the population, we were then about 5% of the population. We were only getting about 0.8% of all foundation money. Recently, the Pew Research Center showed that although we're about 42 million, or between 14 and 16 million of the population, we get about 1.2% of all national foundation money, and overall maybe at best 4%. Now, the bulk of foundation gifts go to higher education, that is primarily to privately elite Ivy League schools, medical institutions, the arts and cultural organizations, only 5% to human service organizations. Now, it's no wonder why Stanford, before the recession, had an endowment of $17 billion, or Harvard, $34.8 billion, or Yale, $22.5 billion. Can you imagine if NHU had at least $1 billion? That's almost a simple $1 billion that we could do today, that kind of endowment. Now, as I see it, the problem lies mainly with the foundations themselves and our own Latino community, our own community's tepid engagement to try to change things in philanthropy. Now, according to the Council of Foundations, in 1968, 93.8% of all foundation trustees were white, of which 6.2% persons of color. That includes Asians, African Americans, and so on. By the year 2000, 89.5% of foundation board members were white and about 10.5% were persons of color. So do the math. It's not much better today. The reality is each foundation is essentially responsible for its own self-appointed trustees. They, by and large, remain ingrown, interlocking, and self-perpetuating. They don't run for office. They don't depend on population polls to make their decisions. Many times they're in New York or isolated from where our communities historically are. But given the fact that these institutions are largely isolated from our communities, it's no surprising that they don't think about Hispanics and our causes. Now, aside from the diversity issues and the flow of dollars, the problem is that foundations do not give, by and large, to causes that involve social change, that challenge accepted mores, and by and large foundations are agents of continuity, not of change. So you're not going to find foundations wanting to support community organizing or organizations that challenge institutions. Now, in 1972, I was one of the first Latinos to be elected to a private grant-making foundation, in this case, the Rosenberg Foundation in San Francisco, which, by the way, became one of the first foundations to give money to Maxa when Nino Lopez was here. And later, I was elected to the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. And when I joined the board there were already four very high-powered African Americans who had been on the board for a long time. So when they talked about minority proposals, they were talking about black proposals. They weren't talking about Hispanics. And so I learned how to develop coalitions, but on that board, I was able to travel throughout most of the world. I was able to deal with people who were on the national scene. So there were very few mentors that I could turn to how does what do you do as a trustee of a major foundation like that? And trying to change opinions about how they see us. I remember when I was getting ready to leave Rockefeller, I'd been on 10 years, and I was helpful in passing through a sunset provision because people would leave the foundation and come back and they'd serve indefinitely. We felt they needed new blood, so we passed this policy that would terminate in 10 years. And I remember pushing very hard to get 2 people to replace me, one a man and one woman. And I gave them names and I referred them to all kinds of organizations for names. No. They wanted what they called marquee names. They want people who are well known. So I remember the chair of the nominating committee connected with, Gallegos, he said, it's too bad you don't have a dozen Cesar Chavez's. We would have eagerly put someone like that on the board. I said, we do have people like Cesar. The problem is, unless you read about somebody in the New York Times, you don't think anybody else has a brain in their head. So one of the 2 people I've been pushing for was elected. He went to all the meetings. He turned out to be a terrific trustee. The other person that they elected was a marquee name from our community. And they said, what do you think? I said, he's a very able person, but he's got his own agenda, and I think you need to find out whether he's going to stay on the board. Sure enough, after I think a year or 2, he left, and we never got that second position back on the board. So, there you go. I've also been on boards where challenging the executive director and dealing with people that, you're questioning can be very uncomfortable. I remember one board meeting for a foundation, it was a break for coffee, and the executive director came up to me and said, Gallegos, I have to talk to you. I said, yeah, what about? He said, you're making the board members very uncomfortable by the questions you ask. I said, Lou, it's not your job to jawbone a trustee. You have a problem, you take it up somewhere else, but don't talk to me. If I have a problem, I'll talk to the chair of the board. So I went back into the board meeting, and one of the board members who never spoke, I think that was one of the first I've ever heard him speak, he stood up, jumped at Gallegos, I don't care what the board thinks, I don't think you're a pain in the ass. So sometimes you have to take the heat. Serving on these boards is never easy. After 50 years, the San Francisco Foundation finally put a Latino on the board, me. There had been an African American on that board for many years, but I don't think he ever pushed to have change. When I got on the board, I immediately pushed to get an Asian on the board. We got a wonderful trustee. And I've always tried to do that, to replace myself with folks who could continue the participation. Now, I know that the nonprofits are going through very difficult situations, given the cutbacks in government contracts and support. They're having a very difficult time, constantly looking for money. And this reminds me of the story of Alice in Wonderland. I think there's a movie out of it now. This is a story of Alice running with the Red Queen. Now, Alice was amazed that no matter how fast they went, they were still under the same tree. And Alice remarked on this to the Red Queen, who replied that in Wonderland, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you have to run twice as fast as that. So I think the foundation issue is a big one for us. It's very rare for us to have wonderful, caring trustees like the Castellano family. Let's give them a hand. They are just it's not only that they are with our community all the time and support the right causes in a very generous way, but they are a model of what we should be thinking about, ways by which we designate money. You don't have to win the lottery to set up a designated gift through the Foundation of the Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley. You can go there and say, I want to put in $10,000, and then I want to designate every year money that goes to a particular cause. So you don't have to set up a big foundation. The problem is that philanthropy has been very reluctant to admit us, to let us in the door. When the community foundation movement was getting started in this country, when Ford, Kellogg, and other big foundations were starting foundations, they set them up all over the country. There were no Hispanics on those boards. That's why 50 years later, San Francisco Foundation just got around to electing one Latino. I mean, that was just terrible. A young man came to see me recently looking for some money, and I said, have you checked with your local community foundation? He said, well, it's just getting started. I said, oh, do they have any Latinos on the board? He said, no. I said, have you guys asked for one? No. So maybe you do, because most of the people who come to see me are looking for an orchard with ripe fruit. Where can I pick some ripe fruit right now? We need money yesterday. Well, have you cultivated your local community foundation? Have you tried to raise money on your own? Have you done certain things? And the answer is usually no. And I said, look, have you decided that maybe we should become owners of the orchard? But to do that, we're going to have to cultivate it. We need to expand our vision of what philanthropy is. We don't get a lot of credit for being givers. We're regarded as takers, because a lot of our families send remittances back to Mexico. But we do give to United Way. We give to churches. So we need to change that image. Now, there are many things you can do. One way you can do nothing and just hope that foundations will one day open their eyes and help. We can look at legislation as an option, but I don't recommend that. If you look at the Tax Reform Act of 1969, where foundations really needed some reforms, but it was really an excuse for foundations to basically keep doing safe grant making, and many have what I call today terror of fright when they make grants. On the other hand, you can do something like Assemblyman Joe Poco did through AB 624. Very courageous. Introduced a bill which basically would have required private foundations to provide racial and gender information regarding themselves and their grantees. This really shook up the foundation world. Man, they pulled out all stops. Council foundations came in, they were really banging on the door, and they had lobbyists. So in the end, 10 CEOs of California-based foundations, remember 10 foundations are not the thousands and thousands of foundations that we have in California. The 10 foundations stepped up and said in the end that they would agree to put up some additional money to fund communities of color. And beginning last year, these 10 foundations would put money in for capacity building, technical assistance, support for leadership development activities to broader and train people for leadership. Well, I think it's good. I mean, I don't think it went far enough, but remember, Joe didn't get a lot of help from our community on this, because a lot of the nonprofits that could have spoken up didn't want to, because they didn't want to be put on you-know-what list by speaking up and criticizing philanthropy. So they kind of kept low-key. But Joe went ahead, and he basically cut out this deal. And we still need to work on supporting it, on modifying, monitoring. Well, as I said, it maybe doesn't go far enough, but good things will happen. But on the other hand, the idea of leadership development assumes that we don't have leadership now, that we don't have people who are ready now. It's not a bull. We have a lot of people who are ready now. You tell me that Dr. Ernesto Galarza could not have been the executive of a major foundation or sat on a major trust as a board member of a major trustee? I mean, people are not real when they look at our community. The other thing is that the nominated the other guy. I never held that against him, but I was scared to death. Well, anyway, there are different models. 25 years ago, I helped found a group called Hispanics in Philanthropy, which has now raised some $40 million, which has been distributed to community-based institutions throughout the country in emerging communities like Tennessee and North Carolina and Georgia, where they're now beginning to set up nonprofits. So HIP has been a good model. It's a collaborative model, but it continues to do that work. We need to press foundations to give core support to foundations like the Silicon Valley, Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley. A couple of years ago, the J. Merber Foundation gave $1 million to start a non-Hispanic community foundation in Orange County. San Francisco Foundation gave 10 years of core support to start the Monterey Community Foundation. That's not going to our communities. In fact, one foundation executive said, why are Mexicans and Latinos trying to segregate themselves? I said, well, Bob, I said, you don't say that about the Levi Strauss Foundation or the Goldman Foundation or the Jewish foundations. You don't accuse them of segregation, so why do you accuse us of trying to develop our own institutions where we're concerned about helping our community to get back? He didn't have an answer for that. So sometimes we have to take direct action. Some years ago, United Way of the Bay Area did not have a single Latino-based organization getting support from their annual campaigns. So we set up a group, Bay Area Raza for United Funds. We picketed United Way, and we got 6 organizations. We confronted Bill Aramone, who was then the head of United Way's Bonds and Councils. I think it was Sal and Paul Sanchez and I went to New York and met with Aramone, who was then the head of United Way, and he was walking around with a silk robe and ascot. And I was leaving, he said, no, Gallegos, you're an arrogant SOB. I said, it takes one to know one. But the story is that Bill Aramone ended up in jail. I didn't. He ended up defrauding United Way and was probably still pulling hard times, so he got what he deserved. So it's been a long struggle. So anyway, on corporate boards, again, being one of the only board members is very difficult. I remember going to one of my first shareholder meetings. There was a wave of 1,000 people, most Anglo people. It's all the head, gray hair there. Afterward, we went to a holding room for mustering together the group of directors and officers, and they were going to put us on these buses to go to Disneyland for a formal dinner. And this vieja comes up to me and says, young man, would you make sure my luggage gets on that bus? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't do luggage. It turns out her husband was a low-level officer. Well, as luck would have it, we were assigned to the same table, the round table. So that vieja keeps putting butter on my plate, a big stack of butter. I said, she's trying to kill me with my cholesterol. I mean, it was talk about being green and young, just learning the hard way. There were no mentors, one of the few. So for 30 years, I served on various boards, getting re-elected every year. And I hope that I opened the way for more Latinos to follow me. I must tell you, and I'm very proud of that, in 30 years of being on boards and committees, I never missed a meeting, not one board or committee meeting. And so part of what people ask me is, what do board members do? Because we go to a lot of meetings, we do a lot of meetings. So make sure that when you accept a commitment to join, that you go to your meetings. I remember pushing to get a Latina on a national nonprofit. They elected her. Then the president called me and said, Gallegos, she never goes to any meetings. We've got to follow up on that. Well, finally, let me say that given our demographics, the status quo is no longer the option for us. We must continue to be part of making positive change happen and not wait to let change just happen to us. We must become part of making change happen, not by being handmaidens to power, but by organizing ourselves to benefit from the most significant and satisfying contributions that organizing can make. Si se puede.
And Carmen, I think it's Carmen. We saw Herman at a dinner yesterday, but at this time I want to give our benefactors, Ali Carmen, a minute to say, make a comment.
I want to answer his remark. Some advice to form a foundation. So what we did is we kind of hunted around, talking to some people that perhaps knew some foundation, people with foundation experience, and of course I mentioned Herman Gallegos. And Carmen and I, we just tried very hard to contact him, finally made a contact with him. He asked us to come to San Francisco and meet with him. We must have spent about 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours. He was telling us all about how to form a foundation. Every time I see him, not only here, but in other functions in the Bay Area, it's just a joy to see him there, and that he was so helpful to us. And he's been helpful all his life, but to us he did us a big favor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Herman.
Herman, you can talk from the chair? No? Okay. Cameras and say something so that we can capture that. Okay? Before we move to our respondents, I also wanted to just recognize that, again, we did have Senator Joe Cotto, I mean, Assembly member. I keep thinking it's 2012. He came by, but his wife Camille is here, so thank you very much, Camille. Like I said, we know it's the women. Also, speaking of the women, talking about first, again, we have Blanca Alvarado here. Official in this county in 100 years. The first person who was ever elected in this county. Did we miss anybody?
Yeah, I just want to say that Juan Macoria's daughter, Ana Marshbarger, was right here. Ana Marshbarger is Juan Macoria's daughter at Latino Prep's High School Academy. So they have a history and a legacy of community. She's a very important community activist. And it's
Thank you.